Hello everyone and welcome back to the History Channel. Today we're diving deep into one of the most consequential periods in American history, the 4 decades leading up to the Civil War. How did a nation, founded on the ideals of liberty, find itself on the brink of tearing itself apart? It wasn't a single event, but a series of compromises, conflicts, and crises that steadily pushed the United States toward war. So let's journey back to the early 19th century and trace the road to war, from 1819 to 1861. Our story begins in 1819. The United States was expanding westward, and with every new territory came a contentious question. Would it be a free state or a slave state? The balance of power between the North and the South in Congress was incredibly delicate. At the time, there were 11 free states and 11 slave states, creating a perfect equilibrium in the Senate. When Missouri applied for statehood, proposing a constitution that allowed slavery, it threatened to shatter this balance. The North, increasingly opposed to the expansion of slavery, was alarmed. The debate raged for months, paralyzing Congress and exposing the deep, raw divisions within the country. Thomas Jefferson, in his later years, famously described the crisis as a fire bell in the night, awakening him and filling him with terror for the future of the Union. He saw it as the knell of the Union. The solution came in 1820 with what we now call the Missouri Compromise. It was a classic political bargain, brokered largely by Henry Clay of Kentucky. Here's how it worked. Missouri would be admitted to the Union as a slave state, but to maintain the balance, Maine, which had previously been part of Massachusetts, would be admitted as a free state. So the count became 12-12. But the compromise went further. It drew a line across the vast Louisiana Purchase territory at the latitude of 36 degrees and 30 minutes north. With the exception of Missouri itself, slavery was to be forever prohibited in all territories north of this line and permitted in territories to the south. For a time, it seemed to work. The immediate crisis was averted and the fire bell was silenced. But the Missouri Compromise was just a bandage on a deep wound. It didn't solve the fundamental moral and economic conflict over slavery. It just kicked the can down the road. The sectional lines had been drawn, quite literally, on the map of the United States. For the next 3 decades, the nation continued to grow, and so did the tensions. The acquisition of vast new territories after the Mexican-American War in 1848, including California, Utah, and New Mexico, reignited the firestorm. California, flooded with settlers during the gold rush, wanted to enter the Union as a free state, which would once again upset the fragile balance of power. The South was furious, with some leaders even threatening to secede or leave the Union. The country was closer to breaking apart than ever before. Once again, it was Senator Henry Clay, now known as the Great Compromiser, who stepped in to try and avert disaster. He proposed a complex omnibus bill, which eventually became the Compromise of 1850. This wasn't a simple, clean solution like the Missouri Compromise. It was a package of 5 separate bills designed to appease both sides. For the North, California was admitted as a free state, and the slave trade, though not slavery itself, was abolished in Washington, D.C. For the South, the territories of Utah and New Mexico would decide the issue of slavery for themselves, a principle called popular sovereignty. More controversially, the compromise included a new, much stricter Fugitive Slave Act. This law required all citizens, including those in the North, to assist in the capture and return of escaped slaves. It imposed heavy penalties on anyone who aided fugitives. This act was a moral outrage to many Northerners. It brought the reality of slavery to their doorsteps, forcing them to be complicit in a system they abhorred. Instead of healing the nation, the Compromise of 1850 only deepened the chasm between North and South. It solved the immediate crisis over California, but created a new source of bitterness and conflict that would fester for the next decade. The fragile peace was shattered just 4 years later by the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This legislation was championed by Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, who wanted to organize the territories of Kansas and Nebraska to pave the way for a transcontinental railroad. To win Southern support for his plan, Douglas proposed applying the principle of popular sovereignty to these territories. This meant that the settlers in Kansas and Nebraska would vote to decide whether to allow slavery. The problem? Both of these territories were north of the 36-30D line established by the Missouri Compromise, where slavery was supposed to be prohibited. The Kansas-Nebraska Act effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise, which had been the law of the land for over 30 years. The reaction in the North was one of absolute fury. It was seen as a betrayal, a blatant capitulation to Southern slave power. The act galvanized the anti-slavery movement like never before, leading directly to the formation of a new political party, the Republican Party, whose primary platform was to stop the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. The most immediate and violent consequence, however, was in Kansas itself. The territory became a battleground. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, each side determined to win the vote and control the territory's future. Fraudulent elections were held and two competing governments were established. Soon, violence erupted. Pro-slavery forces from Missouri, known as Border Ruffians, clashed with anti-slavery Free Staters. This period of brutal guerrilla warfare became known as Bleeding Kansas, a tragic and bloody preview of the national conflict to come. The nation was now a tinderbox, and the election of 1860 was the spark that lit the fuse. The country was politically fractured. The Democratic Party split into northern and southern factions, unable to agree on a single candidate. The new Constitutional Union Party tried to find a middle ground, but the real contest was between the Republican candidate, Abraham Lincoln, and his divided opponents. Lincoln's platform was clear. He and the Republican Party were firmly against the expansion of slavery into the territories. While they promised not to interfere with slavery where it already existed in the South, for Southern leaders, this was not enough. They saw the election of a purely sectional, anti-slavery president as an existential threat to their way of life and their entire economic and social system. On November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln won the presidency. He carried every free state but didn't win a single vote in 10 of the southern states. His name didn't even appear on the ballot in most of the South. For the slaveholding states, the writing was on the wall. They believed they had lost their voice in the federal government and that their interests would no longer be protected. The Union, as they saw it, had failed them. In response, on December 20, 1860, South Carolina became the first state to secede. Over the next few months, 6 more states from the Deep South, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, followed suit, forming the Confederate States of America. The great American experiment was breaking apart. Even with Lincoln's inauguration in March 1861, there was a final, tense standoff. Lincoln, in his inaugural address, appealed for peace, stating, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies." But the situation was dire. Federal forts throughout the seceded states were now in what the Confederacy considered its own territory. One of these was Fort Sumter, located in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. The fort's Union garrison was running low on supplies. Lincoln faced a difficult choice: abandon the fort and legitimize the Confederacy, or resupply it and risk war. He chose to send unarmed supply ships, notifying South Carolina's governor in advance to show his peaceful intentions. But for the Confederacy, the presence of a Union fort in its most important harbor was an act of aggression. They demanded its surrender. When the Union commander, Major Robert Anderson, refused, Confederate batteries ringing the harbor were given the order to fire. At 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, the first shots of the American Civil War were fired on Fort Sumter. The bombardment lasted for 34 hours until the fort finally surrendered. No one was killed in the battle itself, but the attack was a definitive act of rebellion. The time for compromise was over. In response to the attack, President Lincoln issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to put down the insurrection. The road to war had reached its final, tragic destination. The conflict that had been brewing for decades had finally begun. From the Missouri Compromise to the attack on Fort Sumter, the path to the Civil War was paved with failed compromises, political blunders, and deepening moral outrage. It's a powerful reminder of how divisions, when left to fester, can tear a nation apart. Thank you so much for joining me on this historical journey today. If you found this video informative, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments what historical topic you'd like to see covered next. Until then, stay curious.